This is CNN Breaking News.
Now back to our special series, Drug Nation, the war on the border. You've heard from security analysts, lawmakers, even those who support drug legalization. Now we want you to hear directly from a former smuggler. Brian O'Day helped bring as much as 75 tons of marijuana into the United States from Southeast Asia. That was back in the 1980s. He has served time behind bars and is now writing about his time as a smuggler. The book is called High, Confessions of an International Drug Smuggler, and comes out very soon. Brian joins us now live. He's in Toronto this morning. Brian, you recently wrote an op-ed regarding the legalization of marijuana in which you said, quote, "It is time to legalize marijuana. The tax revenue generated could then be used to help addicts. I work with these folks every day in one way or another, and not one of them wants to live the way they do, but they don't know how to stop. They need help, not punishment." So that's one side of the argument. But then there are people who say if you legalize pot, you're just going to create a whole bunch of new addicts who are then going to need treatment. What do you say?
I say that's nonsense. I personally believe that all drugs should be legalized, John, not just pot, because drugs are a medical issue. They're not a corrections issue. And it's similar to what Alfredo said about Cuba. We've done this for 50 years now, and nothing has changed. As a matter of fact, it simply exacerbated the situation. And so it's time for us to take another approach. We can't continue to do the same thing and expect different results.
Right. Okay, well, back on this idea then of legalizing not just marijuana, but all drugs. I mean, is there I'm sure that there are a lot of people who don't do drugs because they're not readily available. Could those people potentially wanting to experiment, if drugs became more widely available and were legalized, try them and therefore get addicted?
John, I have never met anybody who didn't do drugs because they were illegal. The people who use drugs run the gamut of our population, from the wealthiest to the poorest. And they simply are available. They don't need to be legalized to become any more available. As a matter of fact, if they were legalized, the distribution of them would be much more controlled, and then the people who are using these drugs could be educated, could be rehabilitated through the money that we saved. We're throwing $70 billion approximately against the war on drugs this year. We've been doing it for far too long. In excess of $1 trillion has been thrown that way, and nothing has changed. Don't you think? Sorry.
I was going to say, Michael, you make the argument that if you look at the debate over drugs and you look at what's being written about drugs and you look back at the Prohibition era of the 1920s through the early 1930s, if you took the word drugs out of everything that's been written lately and you substituted the word alcohol, it would look like everything that was written during the Prohibition era. And many people say the very fact that the 21st Amendment legalized alcohol got rid of the criminal enterprise around it. But they'll say, okay, hard liquor is one thing, but hard drugs, I mean, we're talking about cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine. I mean, how could that ever be publicly acceptable to legalize those drugs?
Well, we give a methamphetamine type product to kids with attention deficit disorder today, by the way. And it's a horrible thing that we do to these kids. There must be another way, and I don't know what that way is. And look, I wrote an op-ed some years ago, and I went to the Toronto Research Library, and I took headlines and stories from the 1920s that, as you said, told stories about alcohol smuggling. Changed one word in the stories, they were yesterday's paper. And so this didn't work then, it's not going to work now. In the number of prisons that I've been in, and there were a few, 95% through my straw poll, 95% of the violent offenses were committed by people under the influence of alcohol, not heroin, not cocaine, not methamphetamine. Now, granted, those substances are horrible substances, and to be hooked on them is a horrible thing. I worked with people as recently as 2 days ago, spent 3 hours knocking on a person's door, trying to get in there to save this guy's life. And he was in there smoking the crack pipe. It's horrible. And this guy, he gave up his whole life, everything he loved in his life, out the door for the crack pipe. And it's terrible. But should we lock him up? No, I don't think we should. Should we lock up alcoholics? I don't think so. And also, in this town, in Los Angeles, in Atlanta, all over the country and all over the world, neighborhoods are being controlled by gangs. And those gangs have a currency. What's the currency? It's illegal drugs. And so I believe that if we take the currency from these gangs, we'll stop seeing the warfare in the streets in Mexico and the wanton killings in Vancouver, in Toronto, in New York.
Well, it's a fascinating but controversial discussion. Brian O'Day, thanks for being with us. Former person on the front lines of drug smuggling. It's interesting to get your perspective on all of this. Kieran?
Thanks for having me.